Alright, so let's dive into the most important part of painting a character, and that would be the eyes. I brought these images up just for quick reference. They're not really for texture reference, but more for a discussion about how important they are in the process. Now, the eyes are obviously the windows to the soul, and this is very important for us because it's in the eyes that allow us to connect to characters. And if you have very successful eyes, it goes an extremely long way for the audience to be able to connect to what they're looking at and believe that there is a soul and a life in these characters. So in the next series of demos, I'm going to go through a quick assessment of the model and talk a bit about the type of eye models I typically use at home, go all the way through UVs and eventually painting the maps. So let's look at the model here. I'm going to hide the head and just focus on the eyes. So the eye model is going to be very different depending on what studio you're at. Now, some studios build the eyes purely on a procedural basis, and even the textures are almost procedural. Other studios will build every single aspect of the eye from a physiological and an anatomical perspective, so everything is exactly one-to-one what you'd see on a real person. And then other studios use kind of a mixture of both and cheat things where they can. For home use, I use a very, very basic yet very effective setup, and it's just two different pieces to each eyeball. So let's just isolate one and take a look. So the first piece, excuse the penetration in the back. We didn't end up fixing this just because you don't see it for the demo purposes, but typically it'll be wrapped all the way around the eye. However, the point of this is we have a corneal sphere that's actually the outside of the eye, and then we have a inside sphere which is comprised of the sclera, the iris, and the pupil. So let's actually go back to Photoshop and let's bring up an image of an eye. So as I said, some places will build this every piece separately, so they'll have the iris, which is separate, they'll have the pupil, which is separate, that actually refracts, they'll have the lens, that's a separate piece, they'll have the retina as a separate piece. Everything's anatomically correct, and you get some really interesting results, but for our purposes and for personal work, you don't see any of this stuff. So I've kind of cut all this out and just focused on basically three sections: the iris, the cornea, the pupil, and the iris, cornea, and the pupil, and the sclera. So 4. And I've kind of combined those, as you see in this model. I've kind of combined them into two things. So the cornea we're not actually going to paint. In fact, what I usually do is just put a transparent shader on it, mess with the refraction of the cornea, as well as put a noise, a fractal noise in the displacement, so we can break up the reflection so you don't get these clean sweeping reflections of whatever is reflecting back from the environment. And most importantly, I basically paint a mask on the bulge that is housed around the iris. I'll paint that mask and make sure that there's no displacement on this area, so it's much more smooth and it's a perfect mirror, which you can see in eyes if you take a much closer look at some photo reference and stuff. But for this demo, I'm not going to worry about the cornea. So let's talk about this piece here. So the most important aspect of this is the fact that there's a concave shape to the iris. This is going to help tremendously in when we light this character. It's going to provide a lot of nice shading and a nice gradient from shadow to light when we are lighting it. So you get this kind of effect, which gives a lot more depth and realism And then when you add in refraction, it just gives a really nice, elegant, clean look. So this is the basic setup for my eye from a model perspective. So let's grab the eyes and export them. And let's bring them into Unfold to UV. Here we are. So I'm just going to isolate one of them. And I'm going to just cut right down the center here. Grab each piece and unfold. Now I'm seeing a little bit of an issue here. I'm getting this weird indentation at the top. So what I'm going to do is actually unfold this a couple more times. From this Optimize tab. So I'm going to make sure that basically the iteration number, it's kind of hard to tell from this window. I've had to minimize this size. So I think the original iteration number was at 9, so I just cranked it up a couple times. And then I'm just going to unfold this a few more times. It's not perfect, but we're not going to see the top of here, so it's not a big deal. And then we can go back in Maya and do some unfolding there if we have to. So let's move on to the other eye. Unfold this. I have the same issue. I'm not exactly sure why this is happening, but just one of those things, hiccups that you'll experience when you're doing things, and you just kind of have to quickly find a workaround. So for the back of the eyes, we're never going to see these. So what I end up doing is I just scale these down a bit. Actually a lot. And then I'll move them off. And then for these pieces, I'll scale these up. So they get much more real estate. Sometimes I would, depending on how hero we get to the eyes, I'll give each eye its own UVs, so this will take up the entire sheet and then move the other eye over. But for our purposes, that's not going to be necessary. So that's basic setup for the eyes. So let's go back into Maya and let's delete these out and import the new ones like so. There we go. And so I'm going to see if we can get a little bit better solve on these. It's not doing a whole lot for us, so I'm going to leave it as is. If we go back to Unfold and actually turn on the checker grid, you see that it's not terrible. You get a nice uniformity here. A little bit of stretching, but it's not a big deal. So I'm happy with these. So from here, we're going to actually do most of our painting in Photoshop. The first thing I do is I do a quick projection of an eye that I like in Mari, and then make sure that it fits in the head and looks right and the iris is the right size. And then I'll bring that as a reference into Photoshop and do all of my painting in Photoshop. I just find it much easier when I paint eyes to keep everything in Photoshop and then bring them back into Mari for final color correction and leveling and stuff like that. So let's dive into that into the next chapter.